All right, let's do
Okay.
this, guys.
Okay. Thank you all for joining us today on this episode of the Future Podcast. Today we have Mr. Ajoy Philip with us. He works as a director for PricewaterhouseCoopers, or commonly known as PwC. I believe he works primarily in the energy industry. That's where his forte lies. And in today's episode, we are going to talk about the transition to green energy and the challenges and what has been going well so far. So thank you for joining us, Ajay.
Pleasure.
So to get started, I suppose we can use your role at PwC as an anchor point for some of the exciting things that are happening in this space. There's definitely a lot of renewed energy in this area, and rightfully so. We might even say that it's coming in too late, but luckily for us, we are at least speeding ahead. So from what you can share, what sort of insights can you provide from your role in the transition?
Yeah, sure. I mean, let me just kind of start by saying I work in the deal side, so I do mergers and acquisitions. I'm more on the execution side of things, and I'm in the energy side of things. So in the energy sector, so focused on everything related to energy, which would be oil and gas, renewables, oil field services. There's lots happening over there. There's different subsectors within it, and I would say over the last few years, there has been a lot of activity in the renewable space. Specifically, I would say on the solar side, wind, and now even in batteries and other forms of energy. So hydrogen is the probably the one which is really caught on quite a bit in the last couple of years.
Okay.
But there's quite a bit of activity. I would say greenfield operations all across the globe, and now we're seeing a lot of secondary market action. So people have built entire portfolios of solar power assets, clubbing it together, selling it on to other investors, or even doing IPOs, things like that. So there's a lot happening, and it's all across the globe, I would say. The more mature markets like the EU and the Americas probably have a little bit more activity than the others. But I would say, we're seeing activity across sectors, across subsectors, and across the globe as well.
Okay.
Okay. So you work in a certain region.
Yeah, so it's a good question. So I focus mostly on the Middle East, but I work with Middle Eastern clients who invest outwards as well. So the likes of the local sovereign wealth funds that invest globally as well. So I would say most of my work is in the Middle East, but quite a bit as well outside, helping local investors go outside the region.
Okay.
I mean, Middle East has been like always known as the oil, center. So you think it is becoming another hub for renewables now?
Yeah, no, I think that is a fair statement. The vast majority of countries in the GCC, right, the Gulf Cooperation Council, they depend on oil for a very large proportion of their economy, right? Whether it's Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, almost every nation has its own kind of national oil company, has got oil at the heart of their economy. But I would say in the last 10 years, we've seen every single country that I've named look to diversify, right? I think across the GCC, almost every nation has realized that, the future is in renewables. There is a part to be played for each of these nations. So very much we're seeing, a complete shift. And, I would say sometimes it's just not, the perception has kind of really kind of caught up with the reality. But, almost every country, and especially in KSA and in the UAE, there is a lot of focus on bringing renewable technology to the region. And so that's not just about, setting up solar farms, but also bringing manufacturing facilities, bringing the people, just doing all of that hard work, which takes time takes a lot of time to build up a local ecosystem. So there's a lot of work happening in that space as well. Like a Masdar is a good example in the UAE. it's a pretty old company. It's more than 10 years old. Been investing in renewable companies all across the globe, and now it's basically owned by ADNOC, Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, and Dhaka, which is a local Abu Dhabi-based power company. So that focus is probably never changed, but it's a lot more, I would say, right now. Even in KSA, for example, NEOM is a great example of the kingdom putting a lot of money behind just changing the way they operate,
Mm.
whether it's doing simple things like electricity generation to even more complicated things like trying to make buildings
Mm.
net zero compliant. Things like that's actually quite hard. It's quite hard to make concrete, and it's quite hard to make cement uh, less carbon intensive. So there's a lot of work going on in those spaces.
Do you have any information that you can share about how NEOM is going to be powered? Is that publicly available information?
So I think the whole city is still really being conceptualized and built
Mhm.
now. So it's a
Mhm.
bit hard to say.
Mhm.
But the idea is to kind of make sure that it's all powered through renewable sources of energy. Now, that actually means that it's not just going to be solar and wind, but it'll have to have many other forms alongside that.
Mhm.
So I think for now it's more about thinking through it. It's not just about how it's powered, right? It's about when you're building a city, as I said, you've got to use a lot of cement,
Mhm.
and it's actually extremely carbon intensive.
Mhm.
Building cement, making cement is extremely carbon intensive, and there aren't any real scalable technologies at this point in time.
Mhm.
Most there are a few kind of green cement plants, but it's very few.
Okay.
So those kind of things take a lot of time, and that's where NEOM's really trying to build that ecosystem, trying to first find the right technology, then putting money behind it. Then you've got, because there's a whole kind of life cycle. You've got to first figure out the technology, then you've got to build up enough what do you call it, understanding around how to scale it up.
Mhm.
Then you've got to set up the manufacturing facilities and test it, and then it goes into the real world. And a lot of times once things hit the real world, that's when you really know if it works or not. So those are the kind of things which I would say NEOM's doing quite a bit of work in, that I would say maybe other countries aren't doing as much.
Okay. That would
So,
actually.
but so yes, so you would say that it is going on, that it's just not an ad or a campaign, that Neom's things are moving.
Yeah, very much things
Yes.
are moving.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a bit of a journey. So it's still to be seen if it will be successful.
Mhm.
But I think they're putting the diligence, and they're doing the kingdom is doing what it can do. Success is never guaranteed, right? So you have to kind of just put in your best efforts, make the right choices, and then kind of go from there based on the
Yeah.
information that you have.
Because I've heard like a lot of criticism saying that it's not really an ideal choice for a city, to be just on a line
The
because
line,
of
yeah.
the distances between, and why they could go for better designs. But seems like it's happening anyway. And I think KSA already has a history of, building mega projects and going through with it.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't have all the details on Neo, but I think it is. I think the way to think about that is to think that they're trying to do something differently, start from
Mhm.
scratch. It's in a place where there's nothing actually. They are literally starting from scratch over there.
Mhm.
So the possibilities are a lot more. You've got lots more. You've got many more options, right? If you want to build in a square or a circle or a line, it's in most countries you would have to kind of deal with existing construction and lots of other things. So they've got a blank slate, and that's where they're starting from.
And I think that's a huge advantage. Like I think it can be marketed as one of the selling points. So that process that you were describing earlier of how they're testing new technologies, um, I wouldn't have, or at least that didn't come into my mind because they do have quite aggressive timelines. I think one of their timelines is the 2030, which is quite close by. And so like how it could be marketed, and not just marketed, a tangible benefit is for the global community is all of this research that's being done. If there are some breakthroughs in, I have no idea, like an energy capture, storage, yeah, that could benefit the global community. So that's one of the benefits that can be seen.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I think it's still early days. That's what I would say. It's still pretty early days. So, um, and it's pretty ambitious as well. So, I think the best case scenario is, or not the best case, but the most realistic scenario is that, Neom is a city that will be built in stages and phases, and it'll take time for it to it'll never. I think it would, like most cities are never complete, right? There's always something going on.
Yeah.
Uh, so I think that's kind of the way I think about it. It's going to be built in phases and stages, and there's going to be challenges at each phase. So we'll have to see.
Yeah. It's quite possible that it would last for a long period in our lifetimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I don't think I'll. You think it'll be done in your lifetime, Aaron?
I have no idea.
Some portion of it, I guess. Some portion of it, I guess, right?
Uh, I mean, Ajay, coming back, can you explain like how finance is tied in with climate change adaptation
Oh yeah.
on a
Yeah.
more?
See, I mean, I think money is kind of the underlying lubricant, I would say, that kind of makes everything work, right? It's how we kind of transfer value from one person to another. That's kind of the base fundamental point there. And the largest, if you're going to go back to 2000s, early 2000s, the largest companies in this world weren't, it wasn't Facebook and Microsoft, it was actually, Chevron and those kind of companies, Shell. And, those are the top five companies were, I think three were all oil companies, because energy is at the source of what we want to do, right? Money is a lubricant that makes things work, but you need energy for everything. And the fundamental point is that coal and oil are great sources of energy. If you take one ounce of oil or a coal of that equivalent weight, you can get a lot more energy than you can from a similar kind of 1 ounce of, let's say, a solar panel or something. That it's there's a lot of energy that you can get in a very small, uh, very kind of small unit. And that is kind of why we are addicted to oil, right? That's kind of the starting point. We found a great source of energy. We need a lot of energy, and so we use a lot of that source. And the people who own those sources kind of make money. That's how it works. So the national oil companies own the oil fields, so that's why those companies make money. And the international oil companies like Shell and BP and all those companies, Chevron and all, they used to own a whole bunch of oil fields, and they still do actually. They own loads of oil fields, and people pay them for access to that oil. So that's kind of the starting point. For any conversation, it starts with that. There's a lot of money tied up in it. Now, how do you and it's also because of that, it's extremely cheap as well. Oil is a very, very cheap source of energy. Um, so when you start with that, then it's actually very hard to then go and find another source of energy to replace it. Because why would you replace it, right? It's super cheap. It's readily available. Yeah. And we've been using it's a tested technology for more than 100 years. So why would you replace, right? That's the fundamental question. And the answer is because it's carbon intensive, it's destroying the environment, and uh, that's kind of why you would change it. So then what you ask is, okay, fine. So I've got to stop financing these companies, or rather, I've got to at least forget the companies. I want to stop using crude and coal as two examples, and I want to use something else, right? So I've got to find that something else that is, as I said, very cheap, readily available, tried and tested technology that is 100 years old. That is not solar power, just to be clear, right? Solar power is now very cheap, but that's taken a long time, and lots of governments have spent a lot of money, but actually not it's actually not very cheap still, because it's because of the fact that you don't have the sun you don't have sunlight, for 24 hours. You've got it for maximum 12 hours, right? So you got to figure out a way to use another source of energy like wind, for example, which is actually extremely old. We've got wind farms in the EU that are, I think, more than 100 years old. And we've been using, wind to do things like, running mills, for example, threshing. Farmers have been using it for you know, more than 100 years, in fact. So it's about trying to, like, so then you put on the one side, you've got crude and coal, and you replace that with something else like a wind and solar, and even nuclear, I would say, which is not cheap. Also, has certain security issues that people are very concerned about. But frankly, it's also very, very it's not carbon intensive. Let me put it that way. You know, so to move away, get all the money that's stuck in this oil to move away into something else means you've got to hit all of those three things every single time. And that is the challenge that we're facing now. We are seeing a lot more. That's why I said at the beginning, we're seeing a lot more moving away, but it is still a challenge, because as I said, it's not extremely cheap. It's not tried and tested technology, and it's not available all the time. So that's the key challenge over there.
Okay. I
Yeah.
think that was a very well described statement of the problem,
Yeah.
which is getting the money to move from the oil and gas companies to the areas that we now need it to be.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are some solutions to that. One kind of simple solution is to actually, you know, put a price on carbon. Yeah. That's easy to say. I say simple or it's easy to say, but extremely hard to do. If you put a price on carbon, for example, what happens is that you basically kind of raise the price of crude oil, right? You raise the price. Once you raise the price, that means other technologies can become cheaper than that, right? That's one way, and you can see that um, in the EU, for example, they do that quite a bit. Cap and trade is another one where some countries are doing it on a voluntary basis, and then carbon credits is the other thing, which is sort of like the same concept as a carbon tax or a carbon price, but just kind of done in a very different way. And that's also there in the EU and in China and various other countries. So those are kind of external ways of trying to push people towards renewable. And there are more simpler ways as well, which is just gives, like what we're seeing now with, not what we're seeing now, but what we've seen in the past with solar power, for example. You just give a subsidy. Yeah, you just make it really cheap, and you just tell the providers, governments tell providers, listen, we'll pay you to produce solar power, and you try and encourage them that way. I mean, there's many other things that you do it, but kind of there's, one is to make one is if the two things are equal, you try to make solar more expensive, so then renewable is more competitive, and people put money into that. Or if both are equal, you kind of make renewable cheaper, so that people kind of go like, okay, it's a super cheap source, cheaper than what we have right now, so let's kind of put money into that. That's kind of the way that's the kind of simplistic way of looking at it.
Okay.
So we keep hearing a lot about carbon, but carbon is not just the only cause for the global warming. So is there anything else similar to carbon trading that public may not have heard?
Yeah, no, I mean,
Similarly
see,
traded.
yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, methane is the other one.
Yeah.
Methane is like, I think, 10 times more potent in terms of capturing heat and keeping it in the atmosphere than
Yeah.
carbon. But it's, in some ways, it's sort of all coming, like methane is from agriculture and from gas fields, for example. Oil and gas fields emit a lot of carbon. I mean, a lot of methane. Apologies, a lot of methane. So the point is that it's not just, I mean, carbon is probably like a catch-all phrase in some ways for everything that is connected to it. It's about kind of switching off every form of non-renewable source of energy and switching on every kind of renewable source of energy. And so, part of that is also kind of think, getting people to just think about it sometimes, that, there is actually when you transition, when you change, right? Change is very hard. Inertia is where we are normally. That's our kind of normal standing state. Inertia is what we want to do, and change is super hard. So that shift is kind of what everybody wants to make as easy as possible to do, as simple as possible to do. So yeah, I agree with you, Mahat. I think partly is to understand the issue, like understand it's not just carbon, there's methane, there's even, and I'm forgetting now the gases that were in our fridges, which we have now actually cut out quite a bit of.
There's CFCs, yeah.
Correct, exactly, CFC.
Yeah.
So it's all about, trying to basically phase out all these things that are killing us bit by bit.
I wanted to ask about community energy and how like people owning these renewable sources, rather than like with oil. There had to be these giants who could invest so much money. Is community energy becoming a thing today? Is it becoming more famous?
Yeah, I think in some, so, the thing, the way to think about this is that, people want to put money into things that they can trust. Yeah, that's the first thing. So, when you trust something like a bank, yeah, just simple, you trust something like a bank, it is a lot more easier for you to kind of think of, okay, I want to kind of invest in a green solution. Yeah. You can do it many different ways. You can go and put in money directly in a green company, something that does something that's very renewable. Or you could go to a bank and say, listen, I've got a relationship with you, which is many years, a trust-based relationship that's worked very well. You go and find it, right? Or you could kind of then get together all of the people that you know in your community, which is what you're suggesting. In parts of Germany and the EU, they do have it. People coming together and owning their own assets. The question over there is, what's the easiest and the quickest way to get as much money together? The easiest way, frankly, is to use the big pools of money that are existing right now, and just putting that straight into green energy. That's probably the least path of resistance.
Right.
Community energy is important, but I think, you know it would make, you would have to have 1,000 community banks to match, let's say, a large sovereign wealth fund.
So, I mean, now there's this whole fad about decentralization everywhere, even if it's in politics or even in crypto, and so here also that's what I was wondering. Our grid, becoming more
Yeah,
owned by the people.
yeah. So I think when it comes, so I think maybe if I were to kind of turn that question a bit, if someone wants to do something on their own, it is possible to do that. You can do that in many different ways. You could have something as simple as, just put a solar panel on your rooftop. That's something you can do. You need to get a couple of approvals, but that would significantly kind of change your carbon footprint. That's a simple, that's kind of probably one simple way of doing it. If you go to, let's say, if you go to UK, for example, there you can choose a provider, an electricity provider that is fully green. Yeah, that's even easier because you don't need to put a panel. You just need to, pay money, and it might be more expensive, but you can instantaneously do that, right? So if you're going down the path of decentralizing and just kind of taking kind of control, which is what this is about, is taking control over your kind of destiny, right? You can do that as well. You don't need to go down the community path. You can do it other ways as well. You could do things like, how uh, students in large US universities are forcing the universities to not invest in some companies and invest in other companies, right? So, they're pushing these endowments. Colleges in the US have large endowments, right? So forcing them to divest from fossil oil companies, fossil fuel companies, and investing in green companies, right? Things like that you can do as well. And I think I would say that, those things have a very large impact, much more than most people would imagine. In fact, kind of making a large fund to move away completely from fossil fuels has a massive impact actually on the market.
I have two potential ways, and they're kind of, one is a little more in depth. So, hydrogen, how viable is it, and what are the challenges? Why is there a lot of renewed interest? Second topic is the World Bank and their current challenge that they're facing with their leader.
Yeah, I'll take the first one. The second one I've got no clue about. Hydrogen. So hydrogen is kind of like a catch-all phrase, right? So what it is that you're using a particular kind of chemistry. Yeah, just to be clear, just to kind of keep it simple.
Mhm.
Using a particular kind of chemistry to store energy and then to then kind of store it, and then when you want it, to access it. Yeah, you could use something as simple as ammonia and all kinds of things. So how do you kind of create the energy so that it can then be stored?
Mhm.
You create the energy through any ways, n number of ways are there, and that's where the hydrogen thing starts to get really interesting, because the reason people like hydrogen is because you can use it to store and then transport it. That's the key thing there.
Mhm.
Uh, and the first question is, okay, so where do you get the energy from? You
Mhm.
can get it from natural gas, which is where, or some other kind of fossil fuel source.
Mhm.
Um, and that's kind of the vast majority of hydrogen that we see now. Or you could try and make it completely green, which is kind of where you use renewable source of energy to to do your thing, to create the energy.
Mhm.
And the key thing is transportation. So the key thing about solar and all is that you can't move a panel around on top of your house, right? You can, on top of your car.
Mhm.
You need to put it in the car, and how do EVs work? You have a battery, and the battery is what runs the car. So people are saying, instead of having a battery, you put hydrogen,
Mhm.
because if you put hydrogen, you can store a lot of energy in one space, or in one small space,
Mhm.
and then use that to kind of run the. And it's mostly in trucks now, actually.
Okay.
The with the success of Tesla, basically hydrogen cars have pretty much died, I would say. Pretty much is dead.
Okay.
So the use case is now moving towards maybe very, very industrial scale technology solutions. So so cement is a great example.
Mhm.
People are thinking about it from that perspective, or heavy duty vehicles, for example. That's another thing, because you can't have to move a heavy duty truck, let's say a very heavy truck.
Mhm.
There's right now what battery technology just can't do it. It's not possible at all.
Mhm.
We don't have, you need to put lots of batteries, which would increase the weight of the truck, and then it just kind of doesn't work. So that's kind of the use case. Like, when people talk about hydrogen, it's more industrial and transportation towards the very industrial side of things, rather than the normal passenger vehicles.
Okay.
And
So there will be more hydrogen powered trucks than electric as of now.
yeah, I mean, the thing is, you see, as of now, but the thing is, actually, there aren't that many hydrogen. You would think if it worked for all this, it's been the Japanese have been investing into hydrogen, and many countries as well. But especially the
Mhm.
Japanese have been investing into hydrogen for many decades now. So and we don't have trucks. We have got a few here and there, and it's obviously a lot more than electric, to be fair, but it's not that many actually.
Yeah, I mean, I remember Tesla coming up with that truck.
Yeah, so that's we haven't like that hasn't released as yet, right? So
But then nothing happened. Yeah, so now I see why probably some.
yeah, I
Pep-
mean,
Pepsi is
it
supposed
might.
to deliveries in December.
So that's the thing, right? So so if you had asked me 10 years back, electric cars or hydrogen cars, the answer would have been definitely seems like hydrogen cars are much more closer.
Mhm.
But it's just in the last 10 years, electric has just gone a very different way. It's probably succeeded a lot more than anyone ever imagined.
Mhm.
Yeah. Uh, None of the companies, that were existing 10 years back, except Tesla, thought that, electric vehicles were a possibility. But here we are, and it is, it's now pretty much taken for granted, right?
Mhm.
So, there's nothing to say in 10 years' time. Let's say in 2032, we might have electric trucks, but hydrogen
Mhm.
trucks might be another pipe dream that never actually happened.
Yeah. So I'm just curious because since you're working in mergers and acquisition, so there's no one else that's best to fit. I mean, best fit to answer this. We see a lot of these companies based in Northern Europe, Scandinavia, US, a lot of these automobile manufacturers. And recently I came across some brands like Rivian Electric Company. So they came out of the blue for me. I didn't know that such a company was existing, but then they produced, I think, the fastest electric car, I think, right now. So is this happening in elsewhere? Like, are there Indian companies? Are there Middle Eastern companies that are popping up that you are aware of that you can share information about, of course.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that if we take a step back, there's a couple of things happening here. So one is transportation is a very old industry. Yeah, it's extremely old. Uh, you know, I think it's 1910 or 1920s when Ford kind of built Model T. So like, it's a very old industry. So there are obviously in every mature industry there are some countries that are ahead of others. Yeah, and obviously the Japanese and the Americans are, and some of the European countries are ahead of everybody else. But when it comes to electric vehicles, uh, the number one country is China. China is the number one country. Actually, I would say, to be a little bit controversial, but like if you look at BYD, if you look at all the, they've got a a government that actively supports electric vehicle companies. And so it's not just cars. I would say even something as simple as, the scooters that you see, the e-scooters,
Mhm.
they're mostly built in China. So it's not just about, that's what I say, like, it's about transportation, not just about cars and vehicles. Now, Rivian and all of those companies are actually, very much ahead of the curve. Like they're truly path-breaking companies building cars from, company that, as you said, it didn't exist and they suddenly now build cars. That's a function of a couple of things. One is, the US government is supporting, it does support kind of technologies, but also the US and the EU venture capital and investment community is very mature. So they are also able to support these companies to build in stealth mode, you know, get to concept, figure out their kind of customer base, and then take it from there. I mean, there are many electric transportation companies
Mhm.
in the Northern American space that we probably haven't heard of, but in a few years it'll just kind of pop up. I mean, there's many now itself, but that's kind of the difference. In China, it's about the Chinese government supporting them, building them up, and in the EU and North America, it's more about a very mature investor base that is able to build these companies and bring it up. I don't know in Middle East and in India, obviously Tata
Mm.
has its own, um, Tata and Mahindra, sorry, has its own electric kind of full-on brands and cars and fleet. But and I don't think there's anything that I've seen in the Middle East, to be honest. But that's why I said I think it's not it's it's about trying to find the traditional kind of powerhouses who have that basic understanding, and those guys are the ones probably the most likely to succeed as well, which is why you see more companies in those countries.
I can shoot a question. Earlier on in the episode, you mentioned how you work with sovereign funds. So I just want to ask, and again, in terms of allocation of funds, how much is going locally, how much is going internationally, and do you think it's a fair breakup?
Oh, I mean, I think they all have different kind of ways of investing.
Mhm.
The vast majority of them are actually looking to do a bit to do looking to do two things. One is to take some of their money and invest it internationally, because if you put all their money into the local market, you'll have hyperinflation, and it will go crazy. Just you don't have that kind of a market. So
Mhm.
that's kind of what drives them to invest internationally. Traditionally that's been the case. And then they also have a mandate. Most of these companies have a mandate to build up the local sector, to be a patient investor, long-term investor in those nations, right?
Mhm.
So they have that kind of dual mandate to
Mhm.
first go out and just find the best investment, which does not have to be in the country, right?
Yeah.
If you're a UAE-based sovereign wealth fund, the best companies are not necessarily in UAE.
Yeah.
It's out there. So, that's the first mandate, just go find the best ones and invest in them. But the other part of the mandate is to build up their nations, which is why they're different from the large, pension funds and the large investment funds.
Mhm.
Those guys just need to kind of go and find their best company. They don't have a country to support or anything that way.
Okay. And next, like, so the three of us, I mean, we are all from India, and Mahat is in UK, and Ajoy and myself, we are in the Middle East. Like, can you comment on the transition in each of these regions? Let's start with India, since.
Yeah, Abhay, I think India is kind of really made strides in the last 10 years.
Okay.
So a couple of things that have happened is, one is, it's as solar and wind have become cheaper,
Mhm.
it's made a lot more sense for the Indian government to step in and just support those sectors, right? So so if you take a step back, if you think about the per capita consumption of energy, so an individual in India consumes very little power compared to an individual, let's say in Northern America or the EU.
Mhm.
And that's primarily because, we don't have as many refrigerators per person, we don't have as many cars per person, we don't have enough uh, ACs per person, just basic things, right?
Yeah.
So as we become rich, as India becomes richer, we will buy more of these things that need power,
Mhm.
which is what we're seeing. Like, the power consumption per person is going up. Energy consumption per person is going up. So how do you kind of meet this, right? Traditionally, India has kind of gone to the most basic and, as at the most cheapest, which is coal. And we still power the vast majority of our country using coal.
Mhm.
However, as solar and wind has become cheaper, we have started to build some of the largest largest solar utility scale solar plants are in India.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's only because it's super cheap. We have large pieces of land that are well suited for solar plants, so we just build them. So I would say we are on a journey. I would say we still, and I don't know off the top of my head, but a very large proportion of our energy is still generated using coal. Yeah.
Mhm.
But the new capacity coming on board, a very large proportion of that is solar. So if you have an existing capacity, that is pretty much all coal. But
Mhm.
whatever additions we're doing, a lot more that addition is solar and wind.
Okay.
So that's also a transition. I wouldn't say it's a full-fledged, transformation, but it is a transition. And
Okay.
it's happening more on the power side than other bits, which we haven't talked about at all. There is more to this transition
Mhm.
than just oil and fuel and solar. There's actually you think about plastics, you think about all the other industrial stuff, all the agri, cows emit a lot of methane.
Mhm.
And as long as we, have these industrial scale um, poultry farms and cattle ranches, we will continue to emit a lot of methane. And why do we have poultry farms and cattle ranches? Because we all eat chicken and beef and mutton. So those kind of things are also a big part about the transition. How
Yeah.
do we find what you call fake meat, right?
Yeah.
Impossible foods and all of those things are part of the answer.
Mhm. Um,
Uh, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sure Mahat has more questions, particularly to India.
I was just thinking that it's really hard to
Yeah.
take that industry away from India right now, because it is also like really cheap protein, and we are such a big nation. We need that meat, despite all that political atmosphere. But I think food is a big problem that we don't even have a proper answer to. Whereas, like energy, you saying, we are somewhere on the path, but food, I don't think we are fast enough yet.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a good example where we haven't thought about it in any real level of detail. So, the Amazon is deforesting. It's our kind of largest carbon sink. Yeah, uh, it's one of our treasures, right? So that is getting cut down at an incredible scale, and the driving force of it is not like human kind of evil or anything that way. It's just purely our need for cattle ranches.
Mhm.
Mm.
Uh, our need for beef and mutton. It's just that's it. That's literally all it is. As we consume more, we need to have these larger and larger ranches, and those are built by, especially in Brazil, which is a big exporter. Um, it's built by cutting down ranches and cutting down forests. Simply put.
I mean, yeah, it's such a shame. So much land we have, and yet that's where Amazon is where all this is happening, can be converted into soya farms. And India is also, like, I think, second largest meat exporter, meat producer.
Correct. It is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I think we have miles to go. How is that industry mergers happening? Do you work with anything related to food in
I
your?
mean, I would say, the answer over there is, if from a circular economy perspective, or green perspective, I would say the money over there is actually flowing towards other things. It's about trying to kind of find, or right, at least the hot money is towards fake everything, like, fake meat and fake eggs and fake everything, every part of that. How do you replace? Because you can't ask people to eat less. Let's just be clear, right? It's about replacing what's on their plate with something else that's just as good, but isn't as expensive from a carbon perspective,
Mm.
right? There's a lot of money that's gone into it, um, and that's kind of one part of the solution. The other part is also kind of you know thinking about how do we make those parts of the existing ranches more eco-friendly. Trying, organic is part of the answer. There's other parts of that answer, but you're right. I mean, there is probably a lot more for us to do over there than we have done so far.
I like how you said carbon expensive, because even if we take out carbon, I think all these processors are like really energy intensive. So I think renewables will also obviously play a role in the sustainable meat industry. Yeah.
What sort of storage technologies have you come across?
Yeah, I mean, storage is actually the other part of the answer, right? So because we're dealing quite a bit, I think, on this talk more on the power side of things.
Mhm.
So the thing about renewable power, the biggest ones are solar and wind.
Mhm.
Those are intermittent, so you can't just switch it on, switch it off. You can't ask the sun to rise at midnight, right? It just doesn't. You can't figure out when does a wind blow.
Mhm.
So that's where batteries come into place, and storage is probably the right answer. It's
Mhm.
not batteries, it's storage. So storage is like hydropower, for example.
Mhm.
That's actually a pretty big source.
Mhm.
It's actually the one of the oldest sources and also one of the largest. So what do? We take power when it's super cheap. We
Mhm.
use that to pump power up a hill, as an example.
Mhm.
And then when power is expensive, we kind of let the power run down through a turbine and we generate power. That's one way to store hydropower. One way to store power. There are many other ways, and it's mostly using chemistry of some sort. So let's say solid state batteries, uh, even something as simple as, not simple, but something quite new but used quite a bit in out here in the Middle East, is salt,
Mhm.
where it is linked to a concentrator plant, which is a different kind of solar. It's not the usual photovoltaic plant that you see, those panels that you see, it's not that kind of a plant. It's a different kind of technology using solar power itself,
Mhm.
where what you do is during the day, you heat up salt, and the salt kind of holds on to that energy.
Yeah.
During the night, you let the salt cool down, so it releases the heat, and then the heat kind of generates, uses a steam turbine to generate power.
Mhm.
So what you've done is you've kind of stored the energy when during the day when the sun is shining, and you've released the energy and used it up in the night when the sun isn't shining. So that's a great way to store power.
Mhm.
And there are actually, that is probably one of the one of the hottest sectors in the green space, storage, because there's a lot of different. For one, we haven't really done a lot of work in it.
Mhm.
Just thinking about different kind of chemistries, different kind of. When I say chemistry, I mean just basically different kinds of materials, right? Lithium is pretty famous now. We've
Mhm.
got quite a bit of understanding of that, but people think of other kinds of chemistries which we haven't really done a lot of research on. So there's lots and lots of money going into that, trying to figure out how do we use. Is there a chemistry out there that can store a lot of power for a lot of time at a very cheap cost?
So yeah, I have this question about like giant companies. So
Oh yeah, sorry,
like we
sorry.
have,
Before we get into that, maybe I just tell you guys. I think another good example of a storage company is Tesla.
Mhm.
Like that's just it's
They're,
the best example.
they're just
It's
good
the
at
best.
it.
Yeah.
how is it that their company is able to like lead everything that's related to, why isn't it working for any other?
Hmm. No, I mean, I think though, see, there's two things to it. One is they have a person at the top who is extremely focused. Yeah. Uh, and not scared to take tough decisions, which, I think 10 years back was almost going to bankrupt Tesla, which is what people don't realize. And it was almost on the verge of bankruptcy, but then has made a whole bunch of, breakthroughs. So part of that is because they have actually kind of swum against the tide.
Mhm.
They've taken a lot of decisions because they are not a traditional car company, not a traditional company in any shape or form. That whole kind of leadership probably is the number one factor there. Because they have no kind of traditional strengths, right? It's not that they had a lot of money and they kind of used a lot of money to build up the company, or they are traditionally a chemical company that, or a transportation company or a car company, right? So it's just about people when you're kind of building that, and Elon Musk is probably the biggest factor there. But also then, about persistence, right? As the kind of as people have constantly been saying that it's electric vehicles don't work, batteries are too clunky, it's too large, it's too heavy, it's too expensive, all kinds of things. Whereas they have just had a singular focus on these two three things and just executing. That's the kind of short answer. But let me just tell you this as well. There are many other companies that have done plenty. Like BYD is a good example. It's a Chinese company that people don't talk about a lot. They build, they build not as many, but they build a lot more cars than most other companies you've heard, except Tesla. As in, sorry, they build more electric vehicles than most companies in the world except Tesla. But we don't hear much about that.
Yeah.
There are companies like what do you call it? The CATL, which is a large battery company, LG Chem. These are like multi-billion-dollar companies that are in the battery business,
Mhm.
and they are big partners of Tesla, as an example, but probably not so famous.
And Panasonic, I think that's one of the main partners of
Panasonic,
Tesla.
yeah, yeah. The South Koreans, Chinese, and Japanese. Panasonic on the Japanese side. South Korea's got a lot of these companies, and the Chinese as well in the battery side.
So I can go ahead. Another question based on your experience. How much of focus in percentage terms is going into different energy sectors like solar, wind, hydrogen? How would you answer that?
Don't know. I would say a lot is going in to solar probably.
Okay.
Solar's probably got. I think solar's got the one advantage over everything, that it is readily available everywhere, whereas wind isn't.
Okay.
That is the number one thing, right? But I think there's, there's it's going in many, but I would say the most of the money is the most amount of money is probably going to that.
Okay.
But that's not a fair kind of way of thinking about it. There's a lot of money that's going into battery.
Mhm.
In terms of exact dollars, obviously a lot less, but I would say there's a lot of smart money and a lot of attention being played on that as well.
Yeah. And I think that's completely necessary because there hasn't been any major development. But again, I think Tesla had made some significant improvement to their battery technologies, which is supposed to come in the Tesla Semi. Yeah. Do you think the focus on solar will continue, or is there any other strong contender? Or do you think for the time being will be continuing?
No, I think, see, there's no silver bullet. Yeah, I think solar is one of them. Uh, I, wind is the other one, and I think what we're going to see now, especially in Europe,
Mhm.
is nuclear.
Mhm.
We're going to see nuclear energy coming back with a bang. I think there's just no way around it anymore.
Mhm.
Um, and China is building more nuclear power reactors, power stations than anybody else in the world, if I remember right. And so that is probably the one we don't talk about too much, but that's definitely going to come back.
I don't think that, I mean, is nuclear becoming famous in India? Or
We
are
have
we
a few. We
leaving?
have a few. We have a few, but not too many.
But and no new projects that I've heard of at recent
I think,
times.
yeah, I can't remember. I thought there was one or two coming up in India, but you're right. I mean, it's not a big focus, I would say,
I
in
think we are
India.
moving more towards solar.
Yeah, because it's
Yeah,
cheaper,
with
and as I
that.
said, it's cheaper, easily, you can set it up in the middle of a desert in Rajasthan and in large parts of Gujarat and some of these other places, and you can set up very quickly. Nuclear needs a lot
So
of water, needs a lot of security, and most importantly, needs long-term disposal. Nuclear waste is, something that's not in decades or in centuries. It's in actually millennium.
Mhm.
It's in thousands of years.
Mhm.
So, that's why it went out of fashion, right? It was just people realize it's a very long-term kind of scale. So, yeah, let's see.
yeah. So do you have a question, Adam? Or
Enough questions.
take it up?
I have two information share pointers. One was about the World Bank. So essentially, I'll just be basically repeating a headline. So I don't know what the exact title is called, but the head of the World Bank was criticized for a comment he made when he was asked about the impact of climate change. He said, like, I'm not a scientist. Like that was his answer to the question, which was not expected. So there's a lot of backlash, and the headline that I read was how the UK got involved, and whoever is the representative for the United Kingdom. Basically the problem is that they are not, or the request that's being done to the World Bank is that they start funding renewable energy more and stop funding any other like fossil fuel industries. And the second information that I would like to share was about carbon capture. So one technology that I read was about ocean limification. So essentially it involves increasing the alkaline levels of the ocean, which will lead to it capturing more carbon, essentially.
Yeah, and I see. I think carbon capture is uh, sort of like an excuse, I would say.
Mm.
We need that technology. Yeah, and just to be clear, like we do carbon capture now. Like there's carbon being captured and then it's put back into the oil fields to kind of maintain the pressure in the oil field. So Carbon capture is happening.
Mm.
The problem with carbon capture is that the vast majority of carbon capture technology is not to any kind of scale. Like it's all kind of small time technology. It's not. It just doesn't scale, right? Which goes back to that point that I was making. Like, can you is it cheap? Is it readily available? Is it true? Tried and tested technology? It doesn't hit any of those kind of marks.
Mhm.
Number one. Number two, the the other problem is that it is now it's being used. Frankly, it's just being used as a excuse to continue burning fuel, which is probably the other issue. Like the slimification, all that. Those are all things that work.
Mhm.
To be fair, it does work. It's just like it's just not large enough to solve the problem in any shape or form.
Mhm.
Uh, which is why most countries haven't spent a lot of money doing this. It's not like everybody kind of gets it. You can't, even though there's no single silver bullet,
Yeah.
this isn't kind of at the top of anybody's list in any shape or form. It's probably at the very bottom of our list.
Yeah.
Things like, a good example is reforestation.
Mhm.
That's also carbon capture, right? Carbon in the trees.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, I just don't see that.
Very less faith
Yeah,
in its state right now. But I mean,
I
if
just think
it's
people talk about it in bad faith. Actually, that's what I think people talk about it as an excuse and as in bad faith.
Okay.
We can talk about kind of conserving our forests and making sure that rainforests don't kind of get cut down, and that's a much better way of doing carbon capture than trying to kind of
yeah,
you
like
know
spending energy on these tech and then getting into carbon capture and the carbon, whereas plants do it for with water and sunlight. Yeah, so
yeah.
I mean, we're talking about World Bank and funding. So there are obviously these oil giants who could, influence policy. They were, successful in hiding the fact that climate change is real. So, do you think are there renewable energy giants emerging, and is it happening? Is it similar
Yeah,
to?
yeah. I mean, there are super large energy. In fact, I would put it this way: the reason people don't hear about these companies is because they are mostly owned by even larger funds. The largest funds have billions of dollars invested in this, in these kind of companies. The difference I would say is that a it's obviously not as large as the oil companies, and we're kind of now at a stage where people are building those up, but it's not to the scale of, let's say, a Shell or a BP. Likela is a company that was recently bought and sold in Africa. It was one of the largest kind of renewable deals done, and it was kind of funded by a sovereign wealth fund.
Mhm.
Just as an example, and you've probably never heard of it, right?
No.
Never heard of
Yeah,
it, but it was one of the largest deals that has happened in the last, let's say, a couple of months max, 2-3 months maybe. Because what's happening is we're still at a stage where we are building these portfolios of companies of assets,
Mhm.
and it's coming together, and it's coming to now it's starting to become big enough that maybe in a few years' time you might have a renewable company that is just as big as Google and Microsoft, but it's still a little bit away, a little bit.
I mean, if they are gonna push for more electric cars and more green policy, I mean,
Absolutely.
it's good. It sounds very ideal, actually.
No, it is necessary, and that's the only way forward.
Okay, so we have spent a good solid hour chatting about this topic. So I would just want to ask you, do you have any questions for us?
How are you guys kind of thinking about this? In terms of how did you kind of come up with this theme or topic point? What kind of got, because for me, I've been in the sector all my life, so it's what I think about. How did you guys come to this?
Mm, So, okay, if I'm going to shoot, well, one, it was grabbing an opportunity. So, since I got to get to know you and I thought you would add a lot of value, and the area of expertise that you are working in was energy. So, but that always combines with, so it's a combination of reasons, along with what's happening out in the
what
world.
we
There's a lot of attention.
and yeah, and also with what we do, because we just explore topics that we think are relevant in the future, that has that'll add value to society, and that things that we don't hear much about. Even you're I
Yeah.
haven't like listened to somebody in your position, on a podcast. So so when he told me like there's this person, so I was like, okay, let's go. I mean, sounds interesting. He's into climate mergers
Yeah.
and acquisition.
Yeah.
So obviously,
Yeah.
so it was a good choice for us when we looked at it. The topic was interesting. Your role was interesting. That people needed to hear about it.
Yeah, I mean there are much of many more, like there are kind of the reason I asked is because for one we need to have just people kind of need to get educated, so this is really helpful.
Yeah.
Which is why I've tried to kind of keep it as non-technical and as possible, and kind of just really break it down and simplify it. But also there's many podcasts out there that do this very well, that are kind of happy to point you guys to that, because we really need I think we really need to have kind of deeper conversations about this, because this is kind of like really kind of threatens our existence on this planet. Yeah.
Yep.
And right now, as far as I can see, and in my it sounds extremely pessimistic, but it is realistic as well, is that we're not, it's a transition, not a transformation. We actually need a transformation. It's not, we need a lot more faster transition. And our speed is just not there. Yeah, we're just, and I hate to kind of end this at this kind of sour note, but really, that's kind of why I have some hope that you guys came to this and kind of think it's interesting enough to think and talk about.
Yeah.
Because I would guarantee you 5 years back nobody was thinking about this. It wasn't in any shape or form cool to talk about this. So that kind of gives me some hope. And so yeah, it's great. It's great. It's been a good conversation, and so thanks for having me.
Yep.
I've also kind of had to think about this, and it's been a bit of a learning experience for me as well.
I definitely will comment that we all have a lot of learning to do in how we change our own habits, and also particularly since a lot of our age group is still early in the career. So I suppose this can provide a lot of direction in terms of where they can focus their efforts. And so the environment is definitely one area which needs a lot of smart minds and attention and money and energy and blah, blah, blah. So yes.
Yep, that's good.
Thank you so much for your time. And I'm sure you wouldn't mind me saying that people can find you at Ajoy Philip on LinkedIn. I think that would be the best place to reach out to you.
Yep. Yeah. Happy to. Thank you. Thank you guys. Thank you for having
Thank you,
me.
Ajay.
And
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
cheers. Have a good day.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.